Good evening. My name is Rich Whitney with the United National Anti-War Coalition, Green Party Peace Action, the Peace Coalition of Southern Illinois, and the Chicago Committee Against War and Racism, which tells you that I like to go to a lot of meetings. And on behalf of these organizations and the several other co-sponsors of tonight's event, which in one moment I will show you. There we are. All the other co-sponsors of tonight's event listed here, I want to welcome you to tonight's informative webinar in support of the demand to stop the war in Yemen. I also want to thank each of the co-sponsoring groups listed here for help making this program possible. In tonight's program, you will hear from 4 different speakers who have devoted considerable time and effort to the cause of peace and ending the suffering of the people of Yemen. You will hear why this is such an important issue, and you will hear some concrete proposals for action. Indeed, we organized this program in part to help build support for an international day of protest. Oh, hold on one second. There we go. International Day of Protest demanding an end to the war in Yemen on January 25th. That has been endorsed by literally hundreds of peace, social justice, and humanitarian organizations around the world. You will hear a little more about that later. Before introducing our first speaker, I would like to help set the stage with just a few introductory remarks. This comes at a critical juncture for the people of Yemen and efforts to end the war. Just days ago, outgoing Secretary of State Mike Pompeo announced the Trump administration's intention to designate Yemen's Houthis as a foreign terrorist organization, a designation that is not only absurd, but one that will greatly hinder efforts to deliver humanitarian aid to the people of that country. President-elect Joe Biden has promised to end U.S. involvement in the war. However, we know from long and bitter experience, not only that politicians frequently don't deliver on their promises, but that there are many ways by which this particular war can be continued by indirect means. As it is, although the U.S. has continued a direct role in the war that has largely gone unreported, most of the war is being conducted through surrogates, principally Saudi Arabia and the United Arab Emirates, with the U.S. supplying the weaponry and so-called logistical support. So this war is unlikely to stop without concerted mass pressure coming from the American people demanding a complete end to the U.S. role. It has been difficult to get most Americans to pay attention to this war, like most of the other ongoing wars and military occupations of the U.S. in Afghanistan, Iraq, Syria, Somalia, etc. Partly because the corporate news media in this country rarely report on them, and partly because there are so few U.S. military casualties incurred in these operations. But we have to keep trying because we have a moral duty to do so. Murder from a distance is still murder. It is illegal and unconscionable for our government to control the governments and direct the policies of other nations through the use of military force, threat of military force, or military or economic coercion. These acts, in our opinion, are not only morally wrong, they are doubly so because when our government literally spends trillions of dollars on these wars, it is also depriving its own people, us, of the financial means to do things badly needed, like provide needed COVID relief, or combating the climate crisis, or providing universal health care, and do all the other things that a truly civilized government ought to be providing for its people. Here, for example, if you look at the photo of the drone, we see a $100,000 missile launched by a $16 million drone that flies at a cost of $6,000 per hour to kill people in Yemen who live on less than $1 a day. This is obscene, and we have a duty as Americans to stop the killing being done in our name with our taxpayer dollars. With that, then I'd like to introduce our first speaker. We are very pleased to have with us this evening Dr. Aisha Jumon, president of the Yemen Relief and Reconstruction Foundation, which is one of the groups leading the effort to provide humanitarian aid to her home country of Yemen. Dr. Jumon has over 30 years of experience in public health, including viral vaccine preventable diseases, cervical and breast cancer research, surveillance, maternal child health and nutrition, primary health care, and women in development. She is currently working as an independent consultant coordinating health-related projects in her native home of Yemen. So without further ado, I turn the floor over to you, Dr. Jumon, and thank you.
Thank you very much for inviting me to speak and for organizing this very important coalition against the war on Yemen. I'm grateful to be part of this, and grateful also for the beautiful words that you started this meeting with. So I'm going to be talking about the humanitarian crisis from a public health perspective, because that is my job, my day job. I always like to start my presentation to show people how beautiful Yemen is. This is Sana'a city. This is where I grew up. Yemen has a very rich history. It has one of the very first settlements, and the city is a UNESCO heritage site, and it is the oldest continuously inhabited city in the world. I do hope that once this war is over, many of you will get a chance to visit Yemen and learn more about the culture and the people and the history of Yemen. Yemen, as we just said, is experiencing the largest humanitarian crisis in the world. Yemen has about 30 million people. Of these, 24 million are in need of aid. Half of those are in need of immediate aid. And we also have about 4 million displaced Yemeni people. A lot of the people in the West don't know about the impact of the wars that are carried in their names until they see refugees. However, Yemen is under siege and under a blockade. So people do not get to see the displaced people because they are all in Yemen. I also want to share this map to show you the level of hunger that is induced on the Yemeni people. Yemen currently has every part of Yemen. So if we compare the 2000 October to December 2020 to the projection until June of this year, the first thing I want to share is there is no part in Yemen that does not have a problem with food security. Every part of Yemen is experiencing food insecurity. An emergency level is the color red, and crisis is the brown color. And as we can see, the majority of the Yemeni areas are experiencing that. Emergency means that 25% of the people will die if we don't provide them aid. We also have a multitude of diseases that are impacting the people of Yemen. And here we are talking about the diseases that, the cholera. Yemen has the largest cholera recorded in modern history, and actually ever recorded. And we see that about 2 million people have been experiencing cholera in Yemen. In the 21st century, it's actually a sad reality for humanity that they allowed a disease like cholera to infect 2 million people. And here in the map, I'm focusing on Hodeidah. Hodeidah has the largest number of cases, not just with cholera, but also with a multitude of infectious diseases that had been brought up by the war on Yemen. Sometimes my computer freezes. So this is a summary of dengue fever indicators comparing 2018 to 2020. And if we look at the suspected cases of dengue fever, we see that there is a threefold increase in Yemen of dengue fever. Dengue fever now, for Yemen, we have all the 4 serotypes. What that means that anyone who is infected now who's had the previous infection is more likely to get a severe hemorrhagic fever, which results in deaths. This is an epicurve of severe acute respiratory infections in Yemen and the case fatality rate in red for 2019 to 2020 up to week 50, which is up to mid-December. And as we can see, there was a large outbreak, especially last winter in Yemen, with huge fatality rate. And then we see when COVID-19 was first introduced to Yemen, we see also over 20% fatality rate from severe acute respiratory infections, and it continues to rage. This is on diphtheria cases in Yemen. I just want to say here that Yemen has not experienced any diphtheria outbreak since 1980 until the outbreak of the war. And so this also compares 2019 and 2020 until week 50 in 2020. And again, we see a sharp increase in diphtheria cases. Diphtheria is very fatal and highly infectious. And we see the numbers continue to increase even now. This shows the map of COVID-19 cases. Unfortunately, the Yemeni, both governments have decided that they no longer are going to share with us the number of COVID-19 cases. So the northern governorates decide not to report COVID-19 cases. Part of it is they don't have enough resources to deal with it. And then the southern governorate decided they were going to report. However, the reporting was extremely low. And then in October, almost, they decided not to report anymore. But I do want to share with you Hadramaut that has the most reliable reporting. We see of about 1,000 cases, 300 died. Basically, Yemen is experiencing about 1/3 of the cases that are confirmed they're dying. So with COVID-19, as many people in this country are facing, and this discussion in Congress about the relief to a lot of families that are in need, there is a huge impact on hunger, on income for many of the families. Yemeni families have been already suffering from hunger, but also COVID-19 had made it even worse. There was a survey in Yemen that found out that those surveys indicated their top concerns are rising food prices and the loss of income, even more than getting sick. The economic impact of COVID-19 is having on people's lives is causing more harm than the disease itself. When we support the people who are in need and we deliver food baskets to them, we've had multiple families in multiple places tell us that they would rather die of COVID-19 than die of hunger, because dying of hunger is a very painful death. I also want to share with you the value of Yemeni rial against the US dollar since July 2018. And the only reason I wanted to show you this is to show the southern governorates that are under the Emirati and the Saudi coalition compared to the Sana'a government that's not under their control. And as you can see, the price of the Yemeni rial is much better in areas that are not under the Saudi and the Emiratis. The Saudi and the Emiratis continue to tell the world that they are supporting Yemen and providing aid to Yemen. Yet if we look at the areas where they are in control, we see a huge devaluation of the Yemeni rial. What does that translate to? It translates to everything that people need. So if we look at, and these are all, by the way, from UN data. Nothing I'm presenting that's not from UN data. So if we look at the food baskets prices in 2020 in the Sana'a government areas compared to the southern governorates that are under the Saudi and the Emirati, we see again a huge difference in prices, where the average basket price is 38,000 compared to 53,000 under the Saudi and the Emirati control areas. So in turn, that again leads to a lot of hunger. The UN in October issued a warning that they are going to be closing a lot of their programs. And they have, of the 41 programs they have in Yemen, they have closed over 31 because of issues of funding. This is from also Lisa Grande, who used to be the UN representative in Yemen. And she said nearly every humanitarian worker has to tell a hungry family or someone who is ill that they cannot help them. This also came out recently in the December issue of the Humanitarian Update. Again, it says Emergency Relief Coordinator reiterates that Yemen is being starved. And this is something that is very important to recognize, that Yemenis are being starved. This is not a natural disaster. This is a man-made disaster, and the Yemenis are being pushed into famine. And then, of course, you heard in this week or last Sunday, the State Department had decided to designate the Houthis as an FTO. How is that going to impact the Yemeni population? It's, of course, going to reduce funding for the humanitarian response. It's going to halt the work of international aid agencies. It's going to freeze the financial services to Yemen. Banks will refuse to transfer funds to Yemen. As an aid organization working in Yemen, we have to jump through so many hoops to be able to send funds to Yemen. And multiple times we have our funds sent back to us because banks refuse to send money to Yemen because they consider it a risk. And now that will even make it worse for us. Shipping companies and insurance companies would refuse to deliver goods to Yemen, not just aid, and commercial as well. Today, the UN said that even if they agreed to ship to Yemen, the prices are going to go 400%. It's again going to exacerbate an already dire humanitarian crisis and push the majority of the Yemeni population into full-fledged famine. This is the response of aid agency to the designation. We have Refugees International, where they said it's a reckless and destructive. Deeply concerned about the harmful effects, Mercy Corps will hamstring the ability of aid agencies to respond. Norwegian Refugee Council for Asia and Yemen, counterproductive and dangerous, Oxfam, and pure diplomatic vandalism, International Rescue Committee. This is again the Refugee International Trump admin terror designation of Houthis in Yemen, reckless and destructive. 24 million Yemeni at catastrophic humanitarian risk following the US terrorist designation. This is Mark Lowcock, who is the UN relief chief. This is from yesterday. The US designation of the Houthi as a foreign terrorist organization could be the final straw that tips Yemen into not just a small famine, but a truly huge one. And then today he briefed the UN on the impact of this designation. I told the Security Council today that Yemen is on the brink of famine, the like of which the world has not seen in 40 years. Aid agencies believe that the US FTO designation of Houthi will accelerate Yemen's slide into a large-scale famine. He also, at the end of his briefing, had 3 different questions that he answered. It's what is the likelihood of a humanitarian impact of this designation? And his answer were large-scale famine on scale that we have not seen for nearly 40 years. Would licenses and exemptions for aid agencies prevent that? The answer is no. What would prevent it is that designation need to be reversed. My final slide is an option to avoid famine. This is Dave Hardin. Dave Hardin used to be the US head of mission in Yemen, and he also used to be the USAID assistant administrator. He said the simplest course is incoming Secretary of State can pause the FTO designation on January 20th, pending an interagency review. However, my response to that is we don't need an interagency review, because what that's going to do is banks, meanwhile, are going to be de-risking, meaning they're not going to be allowing anybody to send money to Yemen. And the review also will come to the conclusion, like everybody has already said, that this needs to be reversed. So I encourage everybody on this call to work to make sure that this decision is reversed. And again, thank you very much for allowing me to speak today.
Thank you so much, Dr. Jumon. We have everyone silenced, but I think you can consider a hearty round of virtual applause for that. Thank you so much for sharing that vital information. We're pleased to have as our next speaker this evening, Hassan El-Tayyab. He is with the Friends Committee on National Legislation, which for many years has given the peace movement a very valuable voice in Washington. So we thank and recognize the Friends Committee on National Legislation for that good work. Hassan is convinced that advancing a more peaceful and diplomacy-based foreign policy in the Middle East is critical, not only for the family he loves, but for peace and stability worldwide. His writings and commentaries have been featured in numerous news outlets, including BBC World News, The Hill, Al Jazeera, Huffington Post, The Intercept, and more. So without further ado, thank you for being here, Hassan, and we give you the floor.
Thank you. I just need to take a breath after what Aisha just shared with us. It's pretty heavy stuff that we're talking about, and she has just done some incredible work. I think she's a leader and a movement leader to us all. So I just folks should just follow her work and follow Yemen Relief and Reconstruction Foundation. They're doing really incredible work on the ground in Yemen, working with Yemeni source goods and Yemeni volunteers and making sure that food baskets get to people that need it in rural parts of Yemen that are really hard to get to, that a lot of other UN agencies and other humanitarian programs, they don't get out there. And she's doing that work. So I think that's incredible. Now, I wanted to give folks a little bit of an update on what we can do about it. I think, it's a lot of information that we just took in, but what can we do? Well, one, I want to talk a little bit about Biden and some of the opportunities we have. And then two, I wanted to talk about the FTO designation in particular. So Biden has promised to end support for the war. That's it's promising compared to what we've been dealing with. At least somebody's saying the right thing. And there's reason to believe that he will. And it has nothing to do with Biden. The reason why I believe that he will is that activists around the country, led by Yemeni Americans and peace activists and anti-war groups, have come together and forced the Democratic Party to take vote after vote after vote to end support for the Yemen war. We've moved the entire party, and now it's you can't. No Democrat is going to support the Yemen war anymore, and that's because activists did something about this. The question I have, though, is what is going to, are they going to do all of it? Is it going to be a piece of it? And let's just go into what we're doing now. One, we're doing intel sharing, logistical support, and spare parts transfers, and we sell mass amounts of weapons to Saudi Arabia and the UAE. So I think logistical support, I think that's gone. I think the spare parts transfers and the intel sharing, because spare parts transfers, people are making money off that. And the intel sharing, we have this security cooperation going on with Saudi. That's going to be a little bit harder to break. The good news is that Representative Ro Khanna has a plan to introduce a Yemen War Powers resolution the last week of January anyway. So might not matter what he thinks. We're going to put a bill on his desk, and that's where we can come in as a coalition, and to make sure that our members of Congress support the Yemen War Powers resolution and support for the Saudi coalition war in Yemen. I'm doing my darndest to try to make sure that resolution is as expansive as possible. So we're going to try to cover the entire gamut of what we're supporting with the coalition. So that's one action item and due out. Make sure that picking up the phone, calling your representatives and your two senators, and making sure that they're on board. If folks do have particular questions about their individual members and want to just drop who that person is or where you live, and I might be able to sort out and do some puzzle pieces here, because I have too much information in my brain about who the different members are. It's kind of nerdy, but it's what I do. So that's really important. The next piece is cutting off weapon sales to the Saudi-led coalition. Now, that's a bit more of a wait and see. I would say the Yemen War Powers is first priority for the peace movement right now, on all accounts. I think we should just pool our resources, build as broad a coalition, get this over the finish line as a peace movement. But putting that aside, on weapon sales, I'm kind of in a wait and see what Biden does mode. There were joint resolutions of disapproval or bills to block the UAE sale. I don't know if folks saw that, but the Reaper drone reminded me of this big sale that Trump is trying to push through during the lame duck. And almost every Democrat voted against the sale, except for two in Arizona. I hope Senator Sinema and Senator Kelly from Arizona are hearing from you. If anybody here is from Arizona, they should be getting an earful from constituents right now because they voted to arm the UAE. But that particular sale, I'm worried about it because Biden has only talked about Saudi Arabia, has not talked about the UAE, and they're really complicit in the war in Yemen. They've provided 30 fighter jets early on in the war. They are supporting 90,000 proxy forces. They're transferring some of these weapons to Al-Qaeda, Arabian Peninsula, and Al-Qaeda affiliates, and doing all sorts of all sorts of destruction to Yemen, and they need to be held accountable. Saudi Arabia as well, there's a weapon sale that that Biden's going to have to deal with. It's about $800 million. And Senator Menendez from New Jersey, he's the ranking member of the Democrats, soon to be majority chair of the Senate Foreign Relations Committee. He's indicated that he's open to doing a joint resolution of disapproval if Biden doesn't move ahead. Now, the other piece we're trying to get Biden to do is restore and expand humanitarian assistance to all parts of Yemen because the Trump administration cut off a bunch of support. And, we want to pressure the Saudi coalition to actually pay the UAE and Saudi Arabia to actually give money because Yemen is in desperate need of humanitarian aid by billions. They need massive support, especially during COVID. And we also need to not forget about the blockade. The blockade is, I think, everything is just so much worse because of the blockade, cutting off the flow of food, fuel, medicine, clean water, and also humanitarian aid. They're blocking up humanitarian aid. So those are the things we're looking for Biden to do. The one thing that I think we should really someone's asking if the full blockade is in effect. Yes, it is. They're preventing, you cannot fly into Sana'a. They're blocking even emergency evacuations from medical services. You can't get out. They're blocking up UN ships in the harbor and not allowing them to offload their important food and fuel and so many goods, and also the commercial activity. If you want to, buy and sell, it's extremely limited and basically under, complete control over a Saudi coalition with U.S. support. So that's a good question, and we need to put a lot of pressure because the war's not over in the minds of Yemenis until the blockade's over. Aisha, correct me if I'm wrong, but. Now, last I wanted to talk about, unfortunately, the Trump administration is handing us all sorts of, fires to put out as a society. Obviously, this right-wing extremism we have to deal at home. We've got COVID, so many things. But the FTO designation on the Houthis is a particularly damaging one, and it's very terrible. As Aisha indicated, this could push Yemen into a famine. I saw Mark Lowcock from the UN say as many as 5 million people could perish if we don't do something about this, and if this goes through, because it cuts off the ability to do these critical transactions. It cuts off the ability of the UN to even do diplomacy, because if they start talking to the Houthis, then they're aiding and abetting terrorists. So this is really problematic for humanitarian aid delivery and the peace process. So right now we're doing this campaign. I'm going to drop a letter in the chat. Now, this is a letter that FCNL organized, Code Pink signed on, and Yemen Relief and Reconstruction signed on, along with about 50 other groups. And I wish I knew about you all. I would have sent it for you guys to sign. But you can still sign on and share the letter with your members of Congress. So if you want to talk to your member about FTO and the damages, that letter can help. Just feel free, share the text, and just make sure that they make a statement opposing the FTO designation and calling for a reversal on day one of the Biden administration. I think that's the ask for the peace movement right now, and we're collecting statements from members of Congress. And here is a list that I've put together as well. That's all the statements that we've seen from members. So if your member's not on that list, make sure that they are on that list. Somebody said, could I? Yeah. So that's, we've got a lot of work to do. I think we got to come together as a peace movement, calling up our neighbors, calling up other organizations where I don't want to use the word radical, but maybe robust coalition building is in order right now because we're in emergency mode. And we basically have till the 19th to get as many statements as possible opposing the FTO designation. So, I mean, that's only, I think, 5 days away. So if now is the time to act. Feel free, ask me any questions, and I'm looking forward to hearing Danica.
Okay, well, thank you so much. And thank you for your ongoing work and for providing us with those links. This gives us all something concrete to work on. That was an excellent segue too. We're also very pleased to have with us this evening someone from another bastion of the peace movement, Code Pink. Danaka Katovich is the Yemen campaign coordinator for Code Pink. Originally from the Bay Area, she moved to Chicago to study political science at DePaul University. During her college career, she spent her time building the youth peace movement in Chicago. And I might add, I noticed that she's still very much involved in what's going on in Chicago. And since 2018, she has been working towards ending U.S. participation in the war in Yemen. Danica?
Thank you, and thank you to Hassan and Aisha. So I am going to send something in the chat. There's a lot of links in my presentation. So in the chat, I'm sending all the links and what the links are, and then I'll kind of explain them as I go through my presentation. Okay. So you can copy and paste that into your notes or somewhere for later if that's easier for people. And I'm going to go ahead and share my screen. Okay. Can everyone see this okay? Good, okay. All right. So I'm going to be talking a little bit about, oh, I didn't want that to happen. 1 second. Okay, there we go. All right. So I'm going to be talking a little bit about the January 25th, World Says No to War on Yemen, Global Day of Action, and a few other things people can do right now to take action for Yemen. So on January 25th, as Richard said earlier, over 200 organizations signed a statement calling for a global day of action signed by dozens of organizations in different countries. The first link I sent is to the main page for the Day of Action, where you can find a bunch of events, the statement in a bunch of different languages. And then the second link I sent is the Code Pink page for the Yemen Day of Action. In the US specifically, there's going to be protests in Chicago, DC, Los Angeles, the Bay Area, New York, Boston, New Orleans. So there's a bunch going on here. There's going to be events in Canada, Spain, a bunch of different countries. So we're really excited about that. I hope a lot of people come out. They're going to be COVID safe, masks if they're in person. And then a lot of them are going to be car caravans, a little bit more safer. And then also there's going to be a global webinar. So anyone from anywhere can join. That's going to be on the first link, and it's also on the Code Pink page for it. There's going to be a few big name speakers, Danny Glover, Jeremy Corbyn. Now Cornel West has agreed to join us, so we're very excited about that. So hopefully people can come check that out. And the demands for the Global Day of Action are these: stop foreign aggression on Yemen, stop weapons and war support for Saudi Arabia and the United Arab Emirates, lift the blockade on Yemen and open all land and sea ports, and restore and expand humanitarian aid for the people of Yemen. On this day, we have a social media toolkit so people can take to Twitter and any social medias. That is the third link I sent in the chat. So if you check that out, there's going to be click to tweets. So all you have to do is click the link and the tweet will come up on your Twitter all typed out for you. There's a bunch of graphics that you can share with people. I'll be adding a couple more up until the 25th. There are US specific tweets in there, so you can send them to Joe Biden, etc., echoing these demands and amplifying the day of action. So Hassan and Aisha will actually be at this event. This is Code Pink Congress. We have like congressional calling parties every Tuesday. This is one of the links I sent as well. This is going to be next Tuesday. And it's going to be all about calling into Congress on Yemen and kind of to build support for the Day of Action as well. And then, as Hassan and Aisha said, reversing the designation of the Houthis as a terrorist organization is super, super critical and important. So there is a link to Code Pink petition that we have going on. It's going to be to the Joe Biden administration to reverse that designation as soon as possible. For this, like Hassan said, reaching out to your members of Congress and asking them to make a statement, calling for a reversal is really important. The Chicago Coalition just met with Tammy Duckworth, so hopefully she'll be releasing a statement soon. And if anyone needs any support, Hassan sent the FCNL letter, and I can also answer questions. I have a little one-pager that we sent to Senator Duckworth. You can email me. I'll put my email in the chat after this. Code Pink also has a petition to stop and block an arms sale to Saudi Arabia. I think this is the most recent one, so that's a link right there. That's also in the chat. And, you know, I think we're all better advocates when we know and care about the place we're advocating for. And one project I've been so excited about recently is Code Pink and Yemen Relief, Aisha's foundation, have been working together on the Beyond the War series, where we've had 2 episodes so far. The next one's coming out next week. It's going to be about architecture with a Yemeni architect. So you can learn about all those beautiful buildings Aisha showed us a picture of earlier. And we also have 2 past episodes. We meet with like a Yemeni artist to talk about Yemeni futurism, which is really cool. And then we talked with Atiaf Al-Wazir a couple weeks ago about Yemeni storytelling as resistance, and it's been very fun and uplifting, and it gives us a really positive view of Yemen. So I think it's been a very great experience, and I recommend everyone RSVP to the next one. The link's here, and then it's also in the chat. And as always, I really recommend following Yemeni activists and organizations. I put a few up here. One of them's Aisha. This is her Twitter. Shireen Al-Diemi is amazing. She tweets about Yemen all the time. She was actually my first exposure to Yemen. I met her at an event in Chicago, and it was my first time ever hearing about the war in Yemen. So she's amazing. Jihan Hakim, and then her organization's Instagram is Yemeni Alliance Committee. They're one of the groups spearheading the Global Day of Action. Really recommend giving them a follow. Yemen Source is run by Shireen. It has a bunch of data on Yemen tweeted all the time. Woman from Yemen is Atiaf Al-Wazir, the woman I mentioned earlier that we did the webinar with. And then Yemen Foundation, Yemen Relief and Reconstruction Foundation, and Students for Yemen as well. So that's my whole spiel. And I will put my email in the chat if anyone needs any support with reaching out to your senators about the Houthi terrorist designation or anything else about the Day of Action. Thank you.
Okay, well, more virtual applause for Danica. Thank you so much. for the work you're doing and for sharing that information. And again, it was asked in the chat, but we are recording this. So this program will be made available to the various co-sponsors, and it should be widely disseminated. So you should be able to find it. And then that way you can go through the presentations and stop at any point so you can write down any of the links, etc., or take additional notes. Our final speaker for this evening is from Green Party Peace Action. Haig Hovaness from upstate New York is the secretary of Green Party Peace Action, a retired information technology consultant. He's published a number of articles in support of the peace movement. Most recently, and apropos of what we're here for this evening, an article entitled "Target Raytheon Using the Divestment Weapon Against Arms Makers," talking about a little proposal for a type of corporate campaign or divestment campaign against the war machine, with a specific focus here on Yemen. So without further ado, I'll turn the floor over to Haig.
Thanks, Rich. I'm going to share my screen now. And see if I can start this. Well, I'm having difficulty getting to full screen, but I think this will be viewable for most of you. The Raytheon Corporation is a prominent defense contractor. I think it's in the top 5, small but very effective, and with a very diverse range of high-tech weapon systems. What we're going to talk about today is a particular weapon that is being supplied in large quantity to the belligerents in the Yemen war, Saudi Arabia principally. And we've all seen these pictures of carnage from the Yemen war. And I'm going to provide some detail of how Raytheon's weapons are involved in these unhappy events. It's a primary supplier of bombs to Saudi Arabia. Recently, it concluded a almost $500 million sale of precision-guided bombs. It was blocked in the Congress. Both houses actually voted against it. And then the Trump administration used a special procedure declaring emergency arms assistance. And by that means, they were able to push the sale through. A lot of destruction has resulted from these attacks. Congress has been unable to stop them. What can peace activists do? I will describe a new tactic that may be relevant. A lot of people sell weapons to Saudi Arabia. It's a very wealthy petrostate, and it has an appetite for defense. There's been a kind of arms bazaar pumping weaponry into US allies in the Mideast, Boeing, General Electric, Lockheed Martin. But Raytheon is an especially bad actor because its weapons are in the news almost every week in terms of what's called collateral damage, civilian casualties that are always explained as inadvertent and undesired. But it's a very good business. Hundreds of millions of dollars are spent on these smart weapons. And I call it blood money. Basically, it's money that is earned by belligerents inflicting death and destruction, largely on innocent civilians who just get caught in the middle. This is a close look at what Raytheon is selling. What makes it a smart bomb is this technology in the front, which allows it to be laser guided or GPS guided. It has altitude detectors that lets it be detonated 30 or 40 feet above the ground, which kills even more people. And this diagram shows you what this so-called precision weapon can do. This yellow outline is the size of a football field, and anything in this circular area, if it's not behind a wall or in an armored vehicle, is dead. This is what a 30-foot crater looks like that's produced by one of these paveways. And you can assume that anything in about a 100-foot radius was killed in this strike. Anyone standing in an unprotected area was killed. And that about fits the casualties if you consider a busy marketplace. Presumably they had some intelligence indicating that hostiles were in this area. So this picture, I think, really says it all in terms of selling deadly weapons to dubious clients. This is the Saudi Arabian crown prince, who is effectively in charge of Saudi Arabia these days, and his bad judgment triggered this war, and he's quite reluctant to back out of it. So in addition to his waging war on Yemen, he has massively repressed his own people. If I were a Saudi national giving this presentation in Saudi Arabia, I would be arrested and tortured. That's a foregone conclusion. Also, the Saudis, because of their national religion, Wahhabi Islam, are quite friendly to Islamic extremists all over the world and fund their madrasas and so forth. There is no religious tolerance in Saudi Arabia. There are no synagogues, there are no alternate observance. Basically, Saudi Arabia is a country whose government and governing principles are contrary to everything in the American ethos. And yet the money flows. Here is our soon-to-be former president proudly pointing to $12 billion worth of deadly weapons. So we're selling the most advanced weapons in the world to some of the ugliest players in the world. And I hope activists can change that. Another thing to mention is these weapons, once the Saudis have them, can end up in interesting places. The serial numbers on TOW missiles found in Syria match up with weapons that were sold to the Saudis. So the mischief continues beyond the first buyer very often. Raytheon has worked on cultivating a relationship with the Saudis for many years. They are reliable suppliers, but if you look at the scale of Raytheon's business, their total sales to the Mideast are only about 5 or 10%. So although it's a lot of money, it's not the bulk of Raytheon's activity. They sell a lot more high-tech stuff to the US government. More recently, this was the sale that they pushed through, 7,500 precision-guided bombs for $478 million. So why is this so hard to stop? Why are these arms merchants so successful? What I've tried to do in this rather ambitious chart is to show what the anatomy is of these relationships between a major defense contractor within what's called the blob. In recent years, people have started to look at this in a holistic way and not just say, well, what can we do about Congress? What can we do about the State Department? It's really one large interacting complex that President Eisenhower warned the country about a long time ago. And if you look at some of these flows, the green arrows show where the money is moving. And what is quite striking is how little Raytheon expends in terms of dollars influencing this process. in 2019, they took in about $29 billion in revenue. But if you think about political contributions, just 4 million going through their PAC. If you think about all the think tanks, their advertising and PR budget, it's hard to get an exact number, but it's probably about 15 or $20 million. This for Raytheon is lunch money, basically. They are getting a huge return on investment by applying fairly small outlays to key players. The blue lines are not money, they're influence. And this influence is quite powerful in some cases. The careerists in the military, in the State Department, in the Defense Department are constantly in communication with lobbyists and Raytheon personnel. And there is a kind of market in promissory notes, in assurances that there could be a place for you in Raytheon someday if we could use your talents. And that tends to lead to what's called a revolving door. There is one movement of funds I should point out here. I have question marks next to it, but it's widely known that the Mideast is kind of a cesspool in terms of business ethics for large contracts. And every now and again, someone gets caught, but it's pretty much assumed that bribery is an active part of these weapons sales. And it can be very stealthy and very sophisticated. For example, with the Saudis, there can be co-production arrangements in the fine print of the contracts that allow for funding a Saudi business to participate in fulfilling the contract, and nobody really knows where all that money ends up, probably in a numbered account in Switzerland. So this is the structure, and it's important to understand it's very resistant to intervention. However, there's one corner here, the investment community, which is much less susceptible to the standard mechanisms of influence that a contractor like Raytheon can wield. Raytheon can't promise investors jobs in the company. It can't promise them contributions to get them elected. It can't really do much apart from offering them a good return on their investment. And Raytheon is quite dependent on the investment community for the value of its shares. More on that in a little while. So I mentioned the revolving door, and this is another reason Raytheon is worthy of our attention as activists. The recently departed Trump Defense Secretary was a senior lobbyist for Raytheon for a number of years. The newly designated appointee as Biden's Secretary of Defense served on the board of directors for Raytheon since 2016, and presumably will remain somewhat sympathetic to that company in his new post if he is confirmed. And this is just a couple examples of what has now become normalized. No one even thinks it's unusual for people to move from defense contractors into the government, back out again, back to lobbying positions, and round the door spins. We have, in a sense, institutionalized a kind of stealthy corruption in the government of the United States. So what could we do here that's new, that activists haven't done in the past? What I'm raising here as a possibility is what I call targeted divestment. It's a new way to fight this blob monster. And it's based on a couple of phenomena. First is executives are increasingly compensated by stock options and grants. This has occurred for a number of reasons. There are tax advantages, there are PR advantages because it makes your dollar salary look smaller and more reasonable. There are some theoretical advantages. In theory, the executives' interests are more aligned with the benefits to the company if their stock goes up in proportion to their efforts. And very often, stock prices are used as targets for bonuses and pay raises. So anything that lowers the stock price of a corporation of any kind, nowadays impacts the earnings of top management. And that is a potential avenue for influence. At the same time, there's been a trend toward what's called socially responsible investing, where investors are no longer just interested in their total return from an investment. Now they're being persuaded to look at issues like environmental impacts, and I would argue increasingly issues of armed conflict and the risk of war. And public investment institutions are beginning to act along these lines and purge their portfolios of stocks, so far mainly in oil companies or companies with environmental exposure, but increasingly they're thinking about divesting from weapons makers. Because although Raytheon ignores this, I think the ordinary person would say weapons makers are responsible for what happens to their products. There's been a hue and cry of restricting of holding accountable firearms makers, for example, after mass killings in the United States. And Raytheon's weapons are certainly racking up quite a score in terms of human fatalities. So the assertion here is targeted divestment can potentially alter the behavior of weapons makers. This is just a graphical breakdown of the compensation of three of the top officers at Raytheon. The dark blue shows how much of their compensation is in stock. If you can drive down the stock price, it directly impacts the salaries of these leaders, and that will definitely get their attention. And there is movement, as I say, in this direction. The business press is pointing out this is increasingly a trend. Those of you who have investment portfolios should be aware that you can now invest in baskets of stocks, exchange-traded funds that explicitly exclude weapons makers, exclude fossil fuel companies. New York State just dumped all the fossil fuel out of its portfolio. The town of Charlottesville actually divested from fossil fuels and arms makers, arms of all kinds. So the winds of change are moving in this direction. So how would this work? How could we get people to divest from Raytheon stock? We'd have to identify the major stockholders and have some outreach to colleges, universities, state and local governments. Basically, it's a campaign to explain the irresponsible actions of companies that are selling into war zones where civilians are being killed. So I don't think we're going to drive Raytheon out of business, but I think the proposition to put before them is this pressure on their stock would continue until they agree to take some steps of reform, to stop selling weapons to repressive regimes, to stop selling to countries engaged in hostilities, killing civilians, to stop funding the avenues of influence like the think tanks, most of which curiously support aggressive US foreign policies, and to stop political campaign spending, including PACs. Raytheon in their annual report says we don't contribute directly to candidates. That's true. They just pump this money into a PAC, which then contributes to the candidates. It's a neat trick. I should note that some corporations, IBM, for example, have already stopped funding PACs. They just don't contribute to political campaigns at all. And I think this would be a reasonable demand to put on Raytheon. And I think another important outcome of this sort of campaign is it would validate this method as an effective tactic for peace activists. The greater issue here for the peace movement is really a test for concentrated effort. We all admire the work that these individual coalitions perform, but this would be an opportunity to concentrate energies in a narrow area and possibly break through and achieve a notable result. Most peace groups have long agendas and many, many targets, and it can be argued that that dilutes their efforts to some degree. A targeted campaign like this would enable peace groups to act in unison, and if it succeeds in changing Raytheon's behavior for the better, the focus can be switched to Boeing or Northrop Grumman or one of the other usual suspects. It's my opinion that unified action is the key to building an effective US peace movement, and this might be an excellent test case. So in summary, bombs sold by Raytheon to Saudi Arabia are killing people needlessly in Yemen. Raytheon takes no responsibility for the use of its weapons. It says, well, that's just up to the State Department. What our customers do is not our business. Raytheon's a powerful part of the US military-industrial complex with an enormous grip on all the elements of the decision-making process. A campaign of stock divestment targeted on Raytheon could be effective in limiting their involvement in the Yemen war. And I believe peace activists should explore this avenue as a new opportunity for advancing our cause. And I'll be happy to answer any questions in the chat. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Haig. And yeah, we do have now some time for questions. We've got close to half an hour to take questions. You can direct your question to any one of the speakers or to the whole panel if you wish. And now for those of you who are on the phone, I do apologize. I think with a group this size, it would become unwieldy to try to take a stack and to take oral questions. So we're going to try to do the questions that we have on the chat. And let me see if I can find the first one here.
I've got a question.
Yo, yeah, go ahead, Hassan.
How do we get the peace movement to act in unison, man? It's like herding kittens.
Well, yeah, I don't know if anyone else wants to talk about that.
I was on the edge of my seat. That was really wonderful. Yeah, really informative. Great stuff. But that's a good question. I mean, how do we unite? You know, how do we get more people? Yeah.
Okay. Well, Haig, I have my own thoughts on that. Haig, did you want to respond?
Yes. One of the long-term objectives we've set in the GPAC's committee is to promote cohesion among members of the peace movement, member organizations. And we are developing a proposal for a National Peace Congress, which would be a permanent body with representation from all of the peace organizations. And we can provide more information about that proposal to anyone who's interested. We're in very early stages of conceptualizing it, but I think there's a need for it because the peace movement in the United States is kind of a desideratum. I mean, it's something everyone aspires to, and it's extremely decentralized and diffuse right now. And I think there's room for a more formal structure. But if you're interested in that, please contact us.
Definitely. Thank you.
I would just add briefly that on a somewhat more optimistic note, that there are more of us than we think. You know, the United National Anti-War Coalition has 158 organizations in it, I believe. United for Peace and Justice seems to be reviving somewhat and has a fair number of organizations represented in that. So there is potential there. I think part of the problem, though, is it's tended to act more as a network than a true coalition. And so hopefully with concerted effort from people like ourselves, we can kind of move it in more in the direction of more focused action whether it's something like what Haig proposes or another focused action. Hopefully we can get there. And maybe what we're trying to do for January 25th will be a step in the right direction. I do have, let's see, I'm trying to find the first question here that I received. One moment. I see some comments there. Oh, one question that we received: with the actions that Number 45 took against other countries' war crimes, can the Yemenis start suing these companies in U.S. courts? I don't know if anyone has a comment on that. That's
unless Aisha wants to take it, I do have a comment. So this is happening. People are starting to talk about doing a lawsuit against the Trump administration and holding them criminally responsible. And there's an organization in New York. I just chatted with them. Forgive me, I don't remember their name, but they're actually trying to find Yemeni plaintiffs to join a lawsuit against the United States government over the weapon sales to Saudi Arabia. So it definitely can happen and should be encouraged. Whether or not it will be successful, we're not sure. It's all about standing. There's a lot of questions, but I definitely think that kind of creative thinking is great.
anyone else? I did have an earlier question. I apologize for missing it. Someone messaged me, for those of us who are ignorant about the reason and the parties involved in this illegal war, can one of the experts provide a brief history of this war? That could be quite a challenge, but I don't know if any of the speakers would like to maybe address a little bit about the origins of the war and you know what's involved that way.
Aisha, do you want to
start, Hassan, and if there's anything I can add, I'll add to it.
Man, this is so, I mean, there's been a long, complex history in Yemen that I don't want to get into. I want to start with 2015. Well, actually, let's start with 2011. President Saleh was ousted in the Arab Spring. It was a peaceful, nonviolent protest movement brought together Yemeni society, and they went to Hadi to be the vice president. Then he became the president, and he was supposed to be there as an interim situation before they moved to a more representative form of government. After a few years, there was a lot of tension in the country because of mismanagement, corruption, and the Houthis started to gain power, and they seized the capital and they ousted Hadi with the help of ex-president Saleh. And on March 26, 2015, started the Saudi-led coalition onslaught with U.S. support. And the U.S. got involved because at the same time, we're negotiating the Iran nuclear deal, and the Obama administration wanted to appease the Saudi Arabia, and just to make sure that the Iran deal could go through. Obviously, I support the Iran nuclear deal, but not at the expense of Yemenis. And we started providing intel sharing, mid-air refueling of Saudi warplanes. The blockade started, and the violence has really increased. And obviously, the blockade has just been so devastating. And Hadi at the time, he fled to Riyadh for refuge, in the safety of the Saudi family. And I could get more into Mohammed bin Salman. It's really complex. I'll just maybe leave it there if it's okay. There's actually, I will say that there's been a long history of congressional action and activists. I think that's a big part of the story of what's going on, is that in 2017, Ro Khanna introduced a Yemen War Powers resolution, and there's been several votes ever since. And as we force more votes, we've seen a major impact on the coalition's behavior in Yemen. One, we saw the Hodeidah ceasefire the same day that that the Congress and the Senate was able to pass SJ Res 54, the first Yemen war powers. They forced more votes. Unfortunately, Trump vetoed the next resolution, but we saw the UAE draw down militarily. We saw the beginning of border dialogue between Saudi Arabia and the Houthis, and unfortunately, it wasn't until congressional negotiators dropped some of these provisions from the National Defense Authorization Act that we saw that fighting really increase in 2020. And so that's kind of where we're at now. Sorry if that was long-winded.
I have 2 points to add, Hassan. One is the Yemenis actually had met. There was a UN negotiator at that point in time. His name was Jamal bin Umar. And they reached an agreement of a coalition government that included everybody, including the Hadi government, Islah, the GPC, the Houthis. And when they made that announcement, the Saudi called the UN negotiator to Riyadh and started bombing Yemen. So they did not want Yemeni to end their conflict and have a coalition government. That's number one. I think the other issue for me, as someone who's been doing public health all my life, both in the US, Yemen, and a lot of international countries, is there are also laws that govern wars. And almost every single law that governs war had been broken by the Saudi-led coalition, from the blockade to purposefully targeting civilians, to targeting, roads, the bridges that connect the capital Sana'a to the rest of Yemen. They have purposefully targeted every single one of them, to the closure of the airport in Sana'a, to what people call collateral damage. These are purposeful bombing of these places. When you look at the number one airstrikes in terms of targets, it's individual homes. They've bombed, funeral homes. They've bombed schools. They've bombed markets. Everything that produces food in Yemen, they bombed it. So this is a targeted, war crimes that they have committed against Yemen. So regardless of what started it, in my opinion, the way they have conducted this war, that just shows that they are going for maximum damage to the infrastructure and to the people of Yemen. And when I say famine in Yemen, and I'm not the only one who's saying this, every single person who understands the conflict in Yemen, including all the UN agencies, have said that this is a man-made famine. This is, and I usually say, it's a US-supported Saudi UAE man-made famine.
And I would add to that not only are there numerous war crimes that have been committed, but the act of war itself, it's always worth reminding ourselves, is what's called a crime against the peace, in violation of the Kellogg-Briand Pact, the United Nations Charter, the Nuremberg Charter, and many other bodies of international law. The war itself is a crime. We do have a question from someone asking about groups that work for campaign finance reform. I think that's a little off topic. In a way, not. I get it. But I would suggest that people try to answer that maybe through the chat rather than ask the speakers, unless one of you want to comment on that. I know the national. Go ahead.
Represent Us. Do you guys know them? Represent Us. I would check them out. They do a lot of campaign finance reform organizing.
Very good. There's also the National Priorities Project and some other organizations that work on that. There is a question, I think, mainly aimed at Haig. How would you explain the choice to focus on Raytheon rather than any of the other military suppliers, although he does support, or she, excuse me, supports your idea? Any comment on that, Haig?
Yes, Raytheon is just the most brazen of them all. Their conduct in advancing people with close connections to the corporation into prominent positions, and their willingness to cultivate the Saudis and their utter indifference to these horrific scenes of damage that their weapons are directly causing. The word is egregious. You know, they are drawing attention to themselves, and I think they would make a fine example of applying market discipline to a rogue corporation. And I should point out that if they lost this Saudi business, it would not be a death blow to the company. Their total earnings from the Mideast in the past year were $2 billion out of $29 billion. If the pain rises sufficiently, they'll say it's not worth it, and they will back away from this ugly relationship with the Saudis. So that's why Raytheon. But again, the point is concentration of effort. Boycotting all the defense companies is going to be much harder to do in terms of stock divestment than concentrating on one malfactor.
Okay, and I see that Randy has also asked almost the same question. Thank you, Haig. There's a question about Green Party collaboration with the Black Lives Matter movement and an allegation that Raytheon and Amazon have donated to it. I think that's getting us off topic. So I would prefer not to deal with that, except to point out that the Black Lives Matter movement, there's the official one, and then there's the movement. And so it's not a very easy thing to answer. There's a question, have any of the panelists talked with John Rainwater of Peace Action National and Vets for Peace National? I'm not sure if
I used to work at Chicago area Peace Action, so but not, you know, so I'm definitely in coalitions with them. They're good folks.
Okay. Let's see. There's some more suggestions there. Okay. Well, I'm not seeing any other questions from the chat. I think I received one before the program. Let me see if I can find it. Oh yeah, this might be good for Hassan, but others may want to jump in. The law states that Congress may block or revoke a designation made by a Secretary of State of a foreign terrorist organization. And the question is, are you aware of anyone in Congress who is willing to fight to block the designation of the Houthis that Pompeo made on Sunday? We kind of got into that a little bit, but does someone want to elaborate on that? Any, particularly members of Congress that we might be able to work with on this?
Yeah, so they have 7 days, a congressional review period, and through an act of Congress, they can reverse. But it might not be necessary if the State Department comes in and just immediately does this. I think that would be much preferable than having a vote that could be actually kind of hard for some members. You know, it can open up a lot of House members to criticism, you know, from the right, from Fox News. So it'd be better if Biden just does this through executive order.
Okay. Anyone else on that? Okay, let me give another minute here see if there's any other questions from the chat, or I can try to look for raised hands. It's better if you put it in the chat though. Let me ask if any of the panelists have any questions of other panelists.
I talk to them all the time. I know everything there is to know about them. I mean, I maybe I should know more about your personal lives, but so actually, maybe can I ask this question of both Danica and Aisha? Sorry to put them on the spot. Tell us what gives you hope right now.
I'll start with that. I think, knowing how much money is being put into lobbying our Congress and our government, I know the last paper I read on that, it said in 1 year, in 2017, the Saudis had put $27 million on lobbying in Congress. I know from my representative that he told me very specifically that every member of Congress, whether a representative or a senator, each one of them has a designated lobbyist for the Saudis. A designated lobbyist, one person per one member of Congress. And so despite all of that, activists have been able to get actually a lot done. We've got the War Power Resolution to pass both the Senate and the House. Of course, unfortunately, it was vetoed. We've raised a lot of awareness about what's going on in Yemen. So I think it's very important for groups like this here in this meeting to realize how powerful their voices are. We may not have a lot of money, but we do have a passion. We are standing for what we strongly believe is the right thing. And these people in Congress, we vote for them. The lobbyists and the Saudis have, only as much power over them as we allow that to happen. Thank you.
I'll kind of echo that. I mean, Yemen is kind of the issue that brought me into peace organizing when I was a freshman in college. And I think I've seen so much growth in the past 2 and 3 years. It's kind of insane to think about. And it's very inspiring for me. I've been reflecting on it a lot lately because I feel very optimistic for the near future. And I think there's good things coming for this issue. I very much hope in my heart it is. But when we passed SJ Res 7, which was the war powers, we passed that through a Republican Senate. And, it was vetoed, but that was historic. That hadn't happened before. And the Yemen peace movement is so small. It's like I see Aisha and Hassan, I talk to them both like maybe 5 times a week. So, it's very small and, or it's not small, it's a small world. Like we all know each other. And it's been very uplifting. And I think I find hope in the people that I work on this with because they're also dedicated and have literally put years into this. And I feel hopeful that, it's coming to an end soon, hopefully.
Thank you. We do have a question from George. Maybe this is best for Aisha. Is the UN World Food Program still able to work in Yemen?
So until the designation is active, which is the 19th, that's when Pompeo said it will be active, we are still all able to work in Yemen. The concern for all of us is once it goes into effect on the 19th, where do we all stand and what can we do? And it seems like everything will be frozen. And so that's why our hope is that the Biden administration on day one are going to act to reverse this decision. Because if we wait for anything more than that, it's going to be extremely difficult for anyone to do anything. And to the credit of the World Food Program CEO, he did say that WFP got a peace award this year, but he feels shame because they've allowed Yemen to be where it is today. And he was a Republican governor in the US.
And you have another question directed to you from David. Cholera and dengue fever are waterborne diseases. Were water treatment plants targeted, or is it difficult for water treatment plants to get disinfectant chemicals?
Everything was targeted. Everything that can serve people was targeted. Water was targeted. Electricity was targeted. schools were targeted. 50% of health facilities in Yemen were targeted. Hospitals were targeted. The only blood bank in Yemen was targeted. Everything. There was nothing that the Saudis did not think that they could bomb. If they suspect a Houthi is going to be in that building, then that's for them a target or a sympathizer. So yes, everything was targeted. They don't allow fuel to get into Yemen. So there are times when health facilities have to reduce the hours of service or close some centers because they're not able to bring in fuel. I would like to share one slide with you on this topic. I tried not to have a lot of slides. So this one shows the vessels that contain fuel that are supposed to be docking in Yemen. And so that's the name of the vessel, the type of cargo, the permit number that the UN has given to them to dock in Yemen, and how many days they've been in Jeddah. Because once they get into Yemen, the Saudi, they get permit to get into Yemen, the Saudi hold them and divert them to Jeddah. So this vessel, for example, has been sitting in Jeddah for 267 days. Another ship that was allowed to go into Yemen, it was held for 260 days, accumulating 3.9 million in fines. So any ship that's supposed to go to Yemen and gets diverted to Jeddah port, the Yemeni have to pay the price for the fines for holding these ships. And as a result, a lot of companies, shipping companies, do not want to go to Yemen. So it reduces the ability of anyone who wants to say, I mean, we as an aid organization have a hell of a time trying to find an organization that's willing to ship to Yemen. We simply can't ship anything to Yemen. And that's true for all aid organizations. And just to give you another example, when COVID-19 hit Yemen, I had, of course, being in public health, knew that Yemen is going to be hit. There was no COVID-19 reagents in Yemen whatsoever. So I contacted a group in Germany, the Robert Koch Institute, and I said, we need COVID-19 reagents for Yemen. Of course, when you send reagents, you need to have, special ways to ship them. You can't just, put them in a box and send them. So I contacted the World Health Organization and I said, we're getting donations of COVID-19 reagents for Yemen. Would you be able to take it to Yemen? It's urgent. We need to get it into Yemen. WHO agreed. We were able to ship it to Jordan. Somebody from WHO office was able to pick it there. They sent the first shipment without apparently getting permission from Saudi to do that. Because once we got the second shipment, they were not allowed to take it to Yemen. And it took over 4 months to get permissions to get to Yemen. So that shows you that anything that gets to Yemen, it has to go through a permission of the Saudis. For me, as a Yemeni American, if I want to go to Yemen, I have to submit my name with my passport number and page of my passport to the Saudi to get permission to go to see my parents. Nobody can go to Yemen without the Saudis saying they can go to Yemen. Or nobody can send anything to Yemen. Nothing gets into Yemen unless the Saudi allow it.
Aisha, can you mind that I have something to add? That the blockade is insane, but we did have a legislative thing that I wanted to share with people that we might, in maybe a year's time after the passage of the NDAA, there's going to be a report for the first time on all U.S. military participation in the blockade in Yemen. It passed through the NDAA. Obviously, just wanted to flag for folks that we might be able to, hopefully it's not an issue in a year from now, but, we got to do everything we can to put pressure on Biden to end it. But, we have to look at our military complicity in the blockade. And that's something that I want people to really kind of take home, is that our military, there's no way they can keep that blockade going without this, constant military support.
Okay, we are at the 90-minute mark. I didn't necessarily want to have a hard stop, but I think we're actually a little past it. And I actually think that may be a good place to end, is to keep our focus on the blockade and the urgent humanitarian need for that to end. I do see Aisha has put in a link to her foundation in response to a question. I am tempted to answer the question, do you ever feel overwhelmed? But I think we'll leave that one alone for this time.
I do all the time.
Exactly. I think, yes. And any good peace activist will feel overwhelmed.
But if I may, I really think just picking one piece of it and just going for it. I mean, right now we've got this Yemen war powers, just like whatever it is, just pick it and go all in. That would be my comment.
Okay. Well, very good. I think we should probably wrap things up there. I do want to thank all of our panelists, Aisha, Hassan, Danaka, and Haig, and all of the sponsoring organizations. And I want to thank all of you for being a part of this. Again, this was recorded. We will try to make it widely available. And please spread the word. Please support the Day of Actions on January 25th. And for heaven's sakes, let's make a concerted effort to stop this war. Thank you all very kindly.